They stopped the jet bridge mid-stat. Security didn't shout. They didn't run. They simply blocked the narrow metal throat of the aircraft and said, quietly but firmly, "Ma'am, we need you to step back off the plane. Now." For half a second, the cabin froze. The hum of the auxiliary power unit seemed louder. A few heads turned. Someone's phone clattered against an armrest. The injustice landed not like an explosion, but like a sudden vacuum, all the air pulled out at once. Elaine Brooks did not flinch. She stood exactly where she was, one hand resting on the worn leather handle of her carry-on, the other still holding her boarding pass. 63 years old, 5'6", silver threaded neatly through her hair, pulled back low at the nape of her neck. No designer logos, no jewelry beyond a simple gold watch. The kind of woman people learned to underestimate quickly and regretted slowly. "What's the reason?" she asked. Not raised, not defensive, just precise. The younger security officer avoided her eyes. His partner, older, heavier, shifted his weight like a man who wanted this done fast and clean. "There's been a concern raised by the flight crew," he said. "We need to resolve it before departure." Behind Elaine, a man in his 70s sucked in a sharp breath. He wore a Vietnam veteran cap and clutched the armrest as if it anchored him. "Concern about what?" he muttered, not quite under his breath. His wife touched his sleeve, warning him without words. Elaine felt the vibration of impatience ripple forward from the cabin. First class was full. People who planned their lives by calendars and connections. People who hated delays more than they hated unfairness, at least until unfairness stood close enough to smell. She turned slightly, just enough to look back down the aisle. A flight attendant stood rigid near the galley, arms folded too tightly across her chest. Mid-40s, perfect posture. Smile gone. Her eyes were sharp, unsettled, defensive. Elaine had clocked her the moment she boarded. The woman had watched her like you watch a stranger who sits too comfortably in the wrong church pew. "Is this about the laptop?" Elaine asked. The older officer hesitated. That pause said more than any answer. Procedure lived in that pause. And fear. Fear of doing the wrong thing, fear of not doing enough, fear of being blamed later. "We can discuss it off the aircraft," he said. Elaine nodded once, slowly, the way people do when they understand a larger picture forming and accept that the frame has already been chosen. She stepped back. The jet bridge swallowed her with a hollow clang, the door sealing behind her like a verdict. Inside the cabin, conversation exhaled all at once. Someone whispered, "That didn't look right." Someone else said, "They must know something." The flight attendant finally unclenched her jaw, though her shoulders stayed high, braced. The jet bridge smelled like metal and recycled air. Elaine walked between the officers, not escorted so much as contained. Her heels clicked in steady rhythm. She could feel the heat of the moment pressing against her spine, the old familiar sensation of being judged by silhouette instead of substance. At the end of the bridge, they stopped again. The older officer spoke softer now. "We're going to ask you a few questions. Shouldn't take long." Elaine set her bag down herself, a small, deliberate act of control. "Before you do," she said, "I want it noted that I complied fully and that I did not raise my voice or refuse instruction." The officer blinked. "Yes, Mom. Noted." A word that sounded harmless until you learned how powerful records became later. She sat in the molded plastic chair by the window, watching a baggage cart crawl past like a beetle under fluorescent light. In the glass, she caught her own reflection. Calm face, straight back, no cracks visible. She had practiced that face for decades, in rooms where she was the only woman, the only black woman, the only one not invited to after-hours drinks, but still expected to solve the problem by morning. A supervisor arrived. Late 40s, crisp uniform, clipboard held too tight, He didn't sit. He stood, which told Elaine everything about how this conversation was meant to go. "We received a report that you were viewing restricted infrastructure material during boarding," he said. "Given current security sensitivities, the crew followed protocol." "Which protocol?" Elaine asked. He shifted his feet. "Anything that resembles internal systems or schematics has to be escalated." "I work in systems," she said. "I review them for a living." "That may be," he replied, too quickly. "But on an aircraft, perception matters." There it was. The word "no" policy manual admitted, but every seasoned professional understood. Perception. Who looked safe? Who looked out of place? Who made other people uncomfortable without doing a single thing wrong? "Am I being accused of a crime?" Elaine asked. "No," the supervisor said. "This is precautionary." "And will I be allowed to reboard?" she asked. He didn't answer immediately. That silence was the second verdict. "We'll need to complete a report," he said. "It's unlikely this flight will wait." Through the glass, Elaine watched the jet bridge pull back, watched the aircraft door close, watched a life lesson she had learned too many times play out again, dressed this time in uniforms and laminated badges instead of open insults. She took a breath. Slow, controlled. Anger lived in her chest, but it did not drive. Not yet. Her phone buzzed in her coat pocket. She didn't check it right away. Let the moment settle. Let the details imprint. The smell, the sounds, the exact phrasing, the names stitched on sleeves. Memory was leverage when used correctly. When she finally looked, it wasn't a flood of messages. Just one text, short and practical, from a number labeled Martin Hale. "Board still waiting on your technical memo. Everything okay?" Elaine typed back with her thumb. On the surface, nothing looked wrong. "Delayed. We'll update later today." She slipped the phone away and leaned back, eyes on the tarmac. The supervisor cleared his throat, uncomfortable now that the urgency had passed, and all that remained was consequence. What none of them knew, what no one on that aircraft could see, was that the woman they had just removed had spent the last 4 years designing the risk mitigation framework Midland Air had quietly built its future around. That her company's funding was not charity, not sponsorship, but a lifeline wrapped in spreadsheets and understated meetings. That $3 million, written out slowly and deliberately, sat on the edge of a decision that had not yet been finalized. Elaine closed her eyes for a brief second. Not in defeat, in calculation. This was not about a seat. It was not about a laptop. It was about how quickly systems revealed their values when stressed, about who paid the price for caution and who never did. Outside, the engines roared to life. The plane taxied away without her. Elaine opened her eyes, and somewhere beneath the calm, beneath the years of discipline, something irreversible shifted. The terminal felt louder after the door closed. Not louder in sound, but in pressure. Rolling suitcases thudded against tile. An announcement chimed, then repeated itself, too cheerful for what had just happened. Elaine Brooks stood alone near the end of the corridor, her bag at her feet, the jet bridge already retracting like a limb pulled away. A woman in a navy blazer hovered nearby. Airport operations, late 50s. Reading glasses sliding down her nose as she pretended to study a tablet. She kept glancing up, then away, the way people do when they want to help, but are afraid of choosing the wrong side. "Ma'am," she finally said, voice low, "if you'd like to come with me, we can get you rebooked." Elaine studied her for a moment. The woman's hand trembled slightly as she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. Not malice, discomfort. The quiet kind that came from knowing something wasn't right and not knowing how much authority you had to say so. "Thank you," Elaine said. I'd appreciate that. They walked together toward a quieter service desk. Behind them, the gate agent, a young man with slicked hair and restless eyes, was already fielding complaints. He kept saying the same sentence over and over. Security matter, out of our hands, safety first. His voice had the brittle edge of someone repeating words he didn't believe, but couldn't change. At the desk, the woman tapped her tablet, then stopped. I'm seeing a security notation, she said. It flags you for review before rebooking. Elaine nodded once. Of course it does. The woman glanced up, startled by the lack of surprise. It shouldn't take long, she added quickly. Usually just a formality. Elaine didn't correct her. She had learned long ago that people needed to believe the systems they worked for were fair, or at least neutral. Taking that belief away from them was more destabilizing than any argument. They waited. Minutes stretched. 10 became 20. A maintenance cart rattled past, the smell of coffee drifting behind it. Elaine sat perfectly still, hands folded in her lap, eyes tracking nothing in particular. Inside, her mind moved faster, assembling timelines, noting inconsistencies, storing names. Across the hall, the flight attendant from the aircraft appeared briefly, speaking in low tones with the supervisor. Her posture was rigid now, chin lifted too high, as if daring someone to challenge her version of events. When she noticed Elaine watching, she looked away immediately. A man approached the desk, late 40s, business casual, Midland Air lanyard. He had the distracted confidence of middle management, the kind earned by surviving just long enough to believe you understood how things worked. Ms. Brooks, he said, checking the screen. I'm Daniel Price, Customer Operations. He extended a hand. Elaine stood and shook it. His grip was firm, but brief. He was already uncomfortable. I understand there was an incident, he said. That's one word for it, Elaine replied. Daniel cleared his throat. We're reviewing the situation. For now, we'll need to place you on a temporary travel hold with Midland Air, pending resolution. Elaine looked at him steadily. Define temporary. He hesitated. Up to 48 hours. Based on what? She asked. Protocol, he said, then softened his tone. This doesn't imply wrongdoing. Elaine almost smiled. Almost. So I won't be flying with your airline today, she said. I'm afraid not. And if I choose another carrier, she asked, will that be noted as non-compliance? His eyebrows knit together. No, ma'am, you're free to make alternate arrangements. Free. The word hung between them, hollow. Elaine nodded. Then we're done here. She picked up her bag and walked away before he could add another layer of explanation. Behind her, Daniel watched, unease creeping up his spine. He had followed procedure. He always did. But something about the exchange left a residue he couldn't shake. Elaine found a quiet corner near a row of windows overlooking the runway. She sat, set her bag beside her, and finally allowed herself a long, controlled breath. Not a release, a reset. She took out her phone. The message from Martin still sat there, unanswered beyond her brief reply. Martin Hale had been her chief operating officer for 7 years, former Air Force engineer, white, methodical, trusted by rooms that would never have trusted her without him. They made a deliberate pair. She had chosen him carefully. She called him now. He answered on the second ring. Elaine? They removed me from the flight, she said. A pause. Sharp intake of breath. Removed how? Security. Claimed concern over material on my laptop. That's ridiculous. Yes. Are you okay? I'm fine, she said. But this changes things. Another pause. Longer this time. Martin understood subtext. He always had. Do you want legal looped in? He asked. Not yet, Elaine said. I want facts before fury. Understood. Pull the Midland Air file, she continued. Every email, every meeting note. I want a clean timeline. Also, check whether our technical proposal was circulated beyond the Innovation Committee. Martin didn't ask why. I'll call you back in an hour. Elaine ended the call and stared out at the runway again. A different Midland airplane lifted into the sky, its belly catching the light. She wondered who sat in first class on that one, who felt safe, who never thought twice about whether they belonged. Her phone buzzed again, this time an unfamiliar number. She let it ring once, twice, then answered. Miss Brooks, a woman said, older, calm, professional. This is Susan Keller with Keller and Rothman, Civil Aviation Compliance. Elaine's jaw tightened, just slightly. Yes, I represent a passenger who was on your flight, Susan said. He reached out after witnessing what occurred. He asked me to contact you. Elaine closed her eyes for half a second. The veteran, the hand on the armrest. What does he want? He wants to make sure you're not alone in this, Susan replied. And he wants you to know he filed a statement. Elaine felt something shift then. Not relief. Validation. The quiet knowledge that the moment had been seen, named, recorded. Thank you, Elaine said. Susan hesitated. There's something else. The flight attendant filed her own report. It emphasizes perceived risk. Language like that tends to travel. I'm aware, Elaine said. If you decide to respond, Susan continued carefully, timing will matter. So will silence, Elaine replied. They ended the call. Elaine sat still, the terminal moving around her like water around stone. She wasn't angry yet. Anger came later when it could be used. What she felt now was clarity. She opened her laptop again, not to work on the proposal, to document. She typed slowly, deliberately, capturing every detail while it was still sharp. Names, phrases, times written out carefully. 10:20 in the morning, 12 minutes between stops, 48-hour hold. As she typed, a young woman stopped nearby, hovering. Early 30s, nervous smile, airline badge clipped to her belt. I just wanted to say, the woman whispered, I'm sorry about what happened. I was on that flight. Elaine looked up. Thank you. The woman swallowed. It didn't feel right. No, Elaine said gently. It didn't. The woman nodded, eyes bright, then hurried away before courage ran out. Elaine returned to her screen. The words came easier now. This was familiar territory, not the injustice itself, but the aftermath. The quiet space where choices hardened into consequences. By the time Martin called back, her notes were complete. They kept the proposal within the innovation group, he said. No cross-posting, no executive visibility yet. Elaine smiled, slow and thin. That means, she said, they still think this was small. Outside, another plane roared down the runway and lifted cleanly into the sky. Elaine closed her laptop, fingers resting on the lid. Small mistakes, she knew, were the most expensive kind. The hotel room was quiet, in the way only airport hotels ever were. Thick walls, heavy curtains, a low hum from the air conditioner that never quite stopped. Elaine Brooks sat at the small desk by the window, jacket folded neatly over the back of the chair, shoes aligned beneath it, as if order alone could hold the day in place. Outside, Atlanta traffic crawled in red and white streaks. Inside, her phone lay face down. She had learned long ago not to let devices dictate the pace of thought. She reviewed her notes once more. Not for accuracy, for tone. Every word mattered. Not because she planned to accuse, but because she intended to decide. At 6:45 in the evening, the phone rang. Martin Hale again. I spoke to procurement, he said without preamble. Midland moved the funding vote forward. Tomorrow afternoon. Elaine leaned back slightly. Moved forward how? They were planning to table it until next week, Martin said. Now it's on the agenda at 2 o'clock. Elaine pictured the meeting room without having to see it. Glass walls, long table, coffee going cold in paper cups. People who liked to feel efficient mistaking speed for wisdom. They think momentum matters, she said. They think uncertainty is dangerous, Martin replied. And they don't like it when deals feel personal. Elaine let that sit. Who's pushing? Daniel Price, Martin said. Customer operations. He escalated the incident to compliance, but framed it as procedural success. Risk mitigated before takeoff. Clean narrative. Elaine closed her eyes briefly. Daniel Price. Middle management. Loyal to the ladder. Proud of not making waves. She had seen his type shepherd entire organizations into disasters one checkbox at a time. And the innovation group, she asked. Confused, Martin said. They don't know about the incident yet, just that you missed the flight. Elaine stood and walked to the window. Below, a Midland Air shuttle bus idled, engine rattling softly. Good, she said. Let's keep it that way. Elaine, Martin began, then stopped himself. You want my honest read? I always do. This could go either way, he said. If you pull out now, quietly, they'll write it off as scheduling conflict, annoying but manageable. If you stay in and let the vote proceed, you risk being tied to them publicly before this surfaces. And if I do nothing? Elaine asked. They decide for you, Martin said. Elaine watched a plane descend, wheels touching down with a puff of smoke that vanished almost immediately. Then we don't do nothing. After the call, Elaine changed clothes. Not into something dramatic, something deliberate. Dark slacks, soft grey sweater. Comfortable enough to move, respectable enough to be invisible. She left the hotel and walked 2 blocks to a quiet restaurant she had been visiting for years, long before Sentinel Dynamics had an office downtown. The host recognized her. Older man, kind eyes, no surprise. Good to see you again, Ms. Brooks, he said. Same table. She nodded. That was the thing about places like this. They remembered without questioning why. Halfway through dinner, another call came. This one she answered immediately. Ms. Brooks, Susan Keller said, I wanted you to hear this from me before it circulates. Elaine set her fork down. Go on. The incident report from the flight has been shared internally at Midland, Susan said. Compliance flagged it as resolved, but a copy went to corporate risk. Elaine's expression didn't change. And corporate risk requested context from customer operations, Susan continued. Which means people are talking. About the event, Elaine said. Or about me. Susan paused. About why you mattered enough to be careful. Elaine exhaled slowly. That was new. That was the crack. Thank you, she said. Anything else? One more thing, Susan added. A reporter called my office. Trade publication. Aviation governance. They heard a rumor that Midland lost a technology partner over a security dispute. Elaine's eyes sharpened. You didn't confirm? I didn't deny either, Susan said. I told them they'd need to speak to you or the airline. Elaine smiled faintly. Good. After dinner, Elaine returned to her room and finally allowed herself a glass of water, cold and grounding. She sat on the edge of the bed, shoes still on, and let the weight of the day settle into her bones. She was tired. Not fragile, just tired in the way people got after decades of carrying more than their share without complaint. Her phone buzzed again. This time, a number she knew by heart. Elaine, said the voice on the other end. Older, female, calm. I heard you missed your flight. Elaine's shoulders eased slightly. Rachel. Rachel Donnelly had been on Midland's board for 12 years. Retired judge, quiet influence. A woman who understood power not as force, but as gravity. I did, Elaine said. Do you want to tell me why? Rachel asked. Elaine considered, then spoke plainly. I was removed for looking like a problem. Rachel didn't interrupt. She never did. I didn't raise my voice, Elaine continued. I didn't violate policy. I complied. And I was still deemed a risk. Another pause. Longer this time. They escalated the vote, Rachel said. Yes, Elaine replied. They did, Rachel sighed. Daniel thinks this is contained. He's wrong. Yes, Rachel said again. He is. Elaine leaned back against the headboard. I'm not calling to ask for intervention. I know, Rachel said. You're calling because you want me to understand the stakes. Elaine smiled. I always appreciated how quickly you grasped that. Elaine, Rachel said, voice softer now. This company has a habit of mistaking procedure for integrity. So do many, Elaine replied. What are you going to do? Rachel asked. Elaine looked at the ceiling, at the faint water stain shaped like nothing at all. I'm going to let them vote, she said, but not in the dark. Rachel was silent for a moment, then, quietly, send me what you've written. Elaine ended the call and opened her laptop again. This time, she wasn't documenting. She was composing. The memo was short, 2 pages. No accusations, no emotion, just sequence, time, action, impact. She wrote it as she had written every technical recommendation she'd ever delivered. Clean, undeniable, impossible to dismiss without revealing something about yourself. She sent it to Rachel, and to Martin, and to one more address, copied deliberately. Midland Air Innovation Committee. At 9:12 in the evening, Martin texted. They're reading it. Elaine closed the laptop and lay back on the bed, hands folded over her stomach. She didn't feel triumph. Not yet. She felt the slow, steady rise of inevitability, the kind that came when truth moved at its own pace, unbothered by resistance. In another part of the city, Daniel Price sat at his kitchen table, rereading the memo on his phone. His wife asked him what was wrong. He told her it was nothing, just work. But his chest felt tight in a way he couldn't quite name. At Midland headquarters, lights flickered on in offices that had been dark minutes earlier. Emails forwarded, calls made, questions asked that no one had planned for. And somewhere, between those spaces, between the private room and the public reckoning, Elaine Brooks closed her eyes and rested. She knew this phase well. The moment before systems reacted. The breath held by people who had assumed control and were about to discover they had misunderstood the game. Tomorrow they would vote. And tomorrow they would learn what $3 million really cost when it walked away. Morning came without drama. No alarms, no sirens. Just the thin grey light of Atlanta slipping through the curtains like it always did, indifferent to consequence. Elaine Brooks woke before her phone rang. She always did on days that mattered. She dressed slowly, intentionally. Not for effect, for alignment. Navy blazer, ivory blouse, the gold watch again, same as the day before. She believed consistency unsettled people more than anger ever could. At 8:30 in the morning, Midland Air's headquarters began to hum. Glass elevators rose and fell, screens flickered on, coffee machines hissed. The company liked to think of itself as disciplined, risk-aware, process-driven. That belief was about to be tested. In Conference Room Delta, The Innovation Committee gathered early. 7 people, all senior, all accomplished. None of them accustomed to surprises this close to a vote. The memo Elaine had sent sat printed in front of each of them, pages marked with quiet annotations, lines underlined not in outrage, but in concern. No one spoke at first. Finally, Mark Ellison, chair of the committee, cleared his throat. Early 60s, engineer by training. He had spent his life trusting systems because systems had rewarded him for it. "We're here because something procedural became something reputational," he said. "That's generous," said Karen Liu from legal, folding her hands. "Procedural implies neutrality." Across the table, Daniel Price shifted in his seat. He hadn't slept. His confidence from the night before had curdled into defensiveness. "We followed protocol," he said. "The issue was escalated, resolved, documented. No laws were broken." "That's not the standard," Karen replied evenly. "That's the minimum." Mark turned a page. "Elaine Brooks wasn't just a passenger," he said. "She was our prospective partner." Daniel bristled. "We didn't know that." "That's the point," Karen said. The door opened quietly. An assistant stepped in, leaned down, whispered something in Mark's ear. Mark's jaw tightened. "She's in the building," he said. The room stilled. Elaine didn't announce herself. She didn't need to. When she entered the corridor outside conference room Delta, conversations dropped in pitch without stopping entirely. Heads turned. Not because of fear, because recognition had finally caught up to reality. She paused outside the door, straightened her jacket, then knocked once. Inside, 7 people looked up. "Brooks," Mark said, standing halfway before deciding to stand fully. "We weren't expecting you." "I know," Elaine said calmly. "I wasn't scheduled." She didn't ask permission to enter. She stepped in, closed the door behind her, and took the empty chair at the far end of the table. She didn't sit immediately. She let the moment breathe. "I want to be clear," she said. "I'm not here to disrupt your process. I'm here because your process disrupted me." Daniel swallowed. Elaine finally sat. "You're voting today," she continued, "on whether to proceed with funding Sentinel Dynamics." Mark nodded. "Yes." "Before you do," Elaine said, "you need to understand what that vote represents." "Not to me." "To you." Karen leaned forward slightly. "Go on." Elaine didn't raise her voice. She didn't project. She spoke as if the room were smaller than it was, as if each person was sitting across from her at a kitchen table. "When I was removed from your aircraft," she said, "your systems behaved exactly as designed." That's what makes this conversation necessary. Daniel opened his mouth, closed it again. "You didn't ask who I was," Elaine continued. "You didn't ask why I was there. You asked whether I looked like a risk, and your systems answered you." Mark rubbed his temple. "We've already initiated a review." "That's reactive," Elaine said. "I build systems. I don't trust apologies. I trust architecture." Silence stretched. Elaine turned slightly, her gaze settling on Daniel for the first time. "You escalated the incident," she said. "Not accusing, observing." "Yes," Daniel said, "because it was my responsibility." "And did it ever occur to you," Elaine asked, "to pause, to ask one more question, to slow the chain?" Daniel's face reddened. "We don't have the luxury of hesitation." Elaine nodded. "That's what worries me." Mark leaned back. "Elaine," he said, dropping formality, "what are you asking for?" Elaine folded her hands on the table. "I'm not asking," she said. "I'm informing." She slid a folder forward. Not thick, not dramatic. Clean. "This is my decision," she said. "Sentinel Dynamics is withdrawing from consideration." The words landed quietly, heavier for it. Karen exhaled slowly. "You're pulling the funding?" "Yes." Mark's voice tightened. "Elaine, that's $3 million. "I'm aware," she said. "And you're doing this because of one incident," Daniel said, his voice sharp now. Elaine turned back to him. Her expression didn't change. "I'm doing this because of many incidents," she said. "This one just made itself visible." Mark stood. "We can address this," he said. "Training, oversight. We can make commitments." Elaine rose as well. "You can," she said. "And you should. But not with my capital." Karen studied her. "Is this final?" Elaine met her gaze. "It is." No one spoke as Elaine gathered her folder. At the door, she paused. "For what it's worth," she said, "this wasn't an emotional decision. It was a fiduciary one. I don't invest in systems that fail their first real test." She left the room without waiting for a response. Downstairs, the lobby felt colder. Or perhaps she was simply more aware of it now. Her phone buzzed as she stepped outside. Martin. "It's done?" Elaine typed back. "Yes." Another message followed almost immediately. "Press is circling. Midland's comms team is scrambling." Elaine slipped her phone back into her pocket. She didn't need to read the rest. The machine was moving now. Momentum belonged to no one. Behind her, on the 10th floor, conference room Delta erupted. "We just lost the deal," Daniel said, panic finally breaking through. "No," Karen replied. "We revealed ourselves." Mark stared at the empty chair Elaine had occupied. $3 million, he murmured. Karen shook her head. "That's just the number. The cost will be higher." Outside, Elaine crossed the street and didn't look back. The city moved around her. Ordinary, unaware. Somewhere, another boardroom was waiting. Somewhere, another system was watching. And somewhere inside Midland Air, a lesson had begun that could not be unlearned. $3 million had just walked away. And it had done so calmly. The news didn't break like glass. It seeped. Quiet at first. An internal email mislabeled urgent, but forwarded anyway. A Slack message screenshotted, then deleted too late. A calendar invite abruptly cancelled with no explanation. By noon, Midland Air's headquarters felt different. Not chaotic. Careful. As if the building itself had learned to whisper. Elaine Brooks was already gone by the time the first call from corporate communications came through. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Silence, used properly, traveled faster than statements ever did. Across town, in a corner office with a view of the runway, Midland's chief executive, Thomas Whitaker, stood with his hands braced against the glass. Late 60s, grey at the temples. A man who had come up through operations and prided himself on never panicking. He had been in the air when the vote collapsed, landed to a phone vibrating itself toward the edge of the seat. "They pulled out," his assistant had said, voice tight. Elaine Brooks. All of it. Now Thomas stared down at the planes taxiing below, each one a line item, a promise, a liability. "Get me legal," he said, "and risk, and comms. Now." In conference room Alpha, the air grew thick with overlapping voices. "She blindsided us," someone said. "She warned you," Karen Liu replied. "This didn't have to happen," Daniel Price insisted, pacing. "If she'd just identified herself." Karen's head snapped up. "Stop," she said. "Do you hear yourself?" Daniel froze. The room went quiet. In that silence, something fragile cracked. Not policy, not reputation. Ego. Thomas entered without ceremony. He took the seat at the head of the table and looked around slowly, deliberately, the way judges did before speaking. "Tell me exactly what happened," he said. No one rushed to answer. Karen did. She always did. She laid it out cleanly. The report, the escalation, the removal, the memo, the withdrawal. No embellishment, no defense. When she finished, Thomas leaned back. "And we're confident this won't escalate further." Karen didn't answer immediately. "No," she said finally. "We're confident it already has." As if summoned by the word, Thomas's phone buzzed. He glanced down. CNBC. Missed call. He exhaled slowly. Meanwhile, 3 floors down, a junior communications associate stared at her screen in disbelief. The aviation governance reporter had posted a single line. No accusation. No names. Major airline loses technology partner following security-related passenger removal. Sources say cultural concerns cited. It was enough. The phones began to ring. Elaine, for her part, was not watching any of it. She sat in the back seat of a car headed north, the city falling away behind her. Martin Hale sat beside her, tablet balanced on his knee, eyes scanning updates she had chosen not to read. "They're asking for a meeting," he said. "Who?" Elaine asked. "Everyone," Martin replied. "CEO, board, legal. They want to fix it." Elaine looked out the window. Trees blurred past. "They want to contain it," Martin hesitated. "Yes." She nodded. Same instinct, different language. Her phone vibrated. She checked it this time. Unknown number. She let it ring. Then again. On the 3rd attempt, she answered. "Ms. Brooks," Thomas Whitaker said, voice measured but strained. "This is Tom Whitaker." "I know who you are," Elaine said. A pause. "I'd like to speak with you. Directly." Elaine closed her eyes for a brief moment, not to gather strength, to decide how much truth to allow. "I've already spoken," she said. "In writing." "This goes beyond procedure," Thomas said. "We value your partnership." Elaine opened her eyes. "You valued it until it became inconvenient." "That's not fair," he replied. "No," Elaine said. "It's accurate." Silence stretched between them, heavy and instructive. "Elaine," Thomas said, abandoning formality at last. "What would it take?" She didn't answer immediately. Martin watched her carefully, knowing better than to interrupt. Elaine's gaze drifted to the side mirror, to her own eyes reflected back at her. Calm, clear, unmoved. "It would take time," she said finally. "And it would take proof that this wasn't an anomaly, that it was a symptom you're willing to treat, not hide." "We can commit to reforms," Thomas said quickly. "You can commit to language," Elaine replied. "I commit to outcomes." Another pause. Longer this time. "I can't undo what happened," Thomas said. "I'm not asking you to," Elaine replied. "I'm asking you to sit with what it revealed." "And the funding," he pressed. Elaine's voice remained steady. "That decision stands." The line went quiet. Then Thomas sighed. Not theatrically, genuinely. "I wish we'd met under different circumstances." "So do I," Elaine said. "But circumstances are data." She ended the call. Martin let out a breath he'd been holding. "You just said no to a man who's not used to hearing it." Elaine nodded. "He'll survive." "What about us?" Martin asked. Elaine turned to him. "We'll be fine." At Sentinel Dynamics' office, the mood was controlled but electric. Engineers whispered in hallways. Assistants refreshed inboxes. The withdrawal had already become legend, the kind of story people told with lowered voices and raised eyebrows. Elaine addressed her leadership team that afternoon, not with a speech, with a reminder. "This isn't about revenge," she said. "It's about alignment. If an organization can't see risk when it's sitting in first class, it won't see it in its systems either." Someone asked if they should prepare a public statement. "No," Elaine said. "Not yet." She returned to her office and closed the door. Alone now, she allowed herself a moment. Not satisfaction, not exhaustion. Something quieter. The sense of having crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Outside, Midland Air's stock ticked down by a fraction. Analysts debated causes. Some blamed market conditions. Some cited uncertainty. A few mentioned governance. Inside Midland's headquarters, Thomas Whitaker sat with his head in his hands, listening as advisors argued around him. He thought of the woman he had never met until today, of how calmly she had walked away, of how expensive that calm was proving to be. By evening, the story had reached the West Coast, and then Washington, and then places where people read carefully and remembered longer. Elaine Brooks stood at the window of her office as the sun dipped low, the sky streaked with amber and grey. Her phone buzzed once more. A new message. Not from press, not from Midland, from an unfamiliar address. "We heard what you did. Let's talk." Elaine smiled, just slightly. Not because she had won, but because the world had shifted, and she had felt it move. $3 million was gone, but something far more valuable had been exposed, and it was only beginning. The first official statement came out at 7:45 the next morning. Carefully worded, bloodless. Midland Air reaffirmed its commitment to safety, inclusivity, and ongoing review of internal procedures. No mention of names, no mention of funding. Just the corporate equivalent of clearing one's throat and hoping the room moved on. It didn't. By 9 o'clock, 2 analysts had downgraded Midland's outlook. Not sharply, just enough to make investors lean forward. By 10, a pension fund manager in Chicago asked for clarification on governance risk. By noon, the board was no longer debating optics. They were debating exposure. Elaine Brooks watched none of it in real time. She sat in a small conference room at Sentinel Dynamics, blinds half drawn, whiteboard behind her still clean. Around the table were people she trusted because they were slow to speak and precise when they did. Martin Hale, Denise Carter, head of compliance, Jerome Alvarez, senior systems architect. No assistants, no observers. "This is the part everyone gets wrong," Elaine said quietly. "They think walking away is the move. It isn't. Walking away just creates space. What happens in that space decides whether this mattered." Denise nodded. "Midland's legal team will try to reframe this as misunderstanding, not misconduct." "They already are," Martin said. "They're pushing language about perception gaps." Elaine's mouth tightened. Perception gaps are what people call bias when they're afraid of the word. Jerome leaned forward. "What do you want us to do?" Elaine didn't answer immediately. She stood and walked to the whiteboard, picked up a marker, wrote 3 words in deliberate block letters. "Systems fail quietly." She capped the marker, turned back to them. This was never about a flight. It was about what happens when systems are stressed and no one in the chain feels responsible enough to slow it down. Denise exhaled. "You're talking about precedent." "Yes," Elaine said. "And leverage." Martin raised an eyebrow. "Carefully." Elaine smiled faintly. "Always." That afternoon, Midland's General Counsel sent a formal request for mediation. Neutral venue, confidential terms, a chance to de-escalate. Elaine read it once, then forwarded it to Denise without comment. Denise replied 10 minutes later. They're worried this could trigger regulatory attention. Elaine typed back. It already has. Because while Midland tried to keep the narrative contained, other systems had begun to notice. A compliance officer at a competing airline forwarded the trade article to her supervisor with a single question. Could this happen here? A retired FAA official shared the link in a private forum with 3 words attached. Patterns repeat. And in Washington, a staffer at the Department of Transportation bookmarked the story without telling anyone why. Elaine's phone rang again that evening. This time, she answered on the first ring. Miss Brooks, the voice said, male, polished. My name is Alan Mercer. I represent the Air Travelers' Rights Coalition. Elaine closed her eyes briefly, not from fatigue, from recognition. What can I do for you, Alan? We've been following the Midland situation, he said, discreetly. I'm sure, Elaine replied. We'd like to speak with you, he continued, off the record, about broader implications. Elaine leaned back in her chair. I'm not a plaintiff. No, Alan said. You're something more useful. Elaine smiled without humor. Careful. We believe your experience illustrates a systemic issue, he said, one that rarely surfaces with this level of documentation and credibility. Elaine considered. Send me your questions. After the call, she sat alone for a moment. This was the part she had anticipated and resented in equal measure, when personal experience became public property. When people began to project meaning onto you, whether you invited it or not. Her assistant knocked softly. Miss Brooks, there's a reporter downstairs. Elaine didn't look up. Which outlet? Public radio, her assistant said. Long-form interview. Elaine paused. Public radio meant time, nuance, an audience that listened instead of skimmed. Mostly older, mostly patient. Tell them I'm unavailable, Elaine said, but that I'll consider it next week. The assistant nodded and left. That night, Elaine slept poorly. Not because of anxiety, because her mind kept returning to the same image. The flight attendant's face when authority had been handed to her without reflection. The ease with which escalation had replaced curiosity. In the morning, Midland's board convened an emergency session. Thomas Whitaker sat at the head of the table, his expression drawn. Across from him were directors who had weathered recessions, mergers, near misses. None of them liked surprises. All of them disliked headlines. This is no longer contained, said one director, a former banking executive. We're being discussed in governance circles. Another added, we have exposure on 2 fronts, reputation and regulation. Thomas rubbed his hands together. Elaine Brooks has not gone public. Yet, someone said. And when she does, Karen Liu said, joining by video, it won't look like an attack. It will look like a case study. That phrase landed hard. What do we do? Thomas asked. Karen didn't hesitate. You start by asking why your people thought removing a compliant passenger was safer than asking one more question. Silence followed. At Sentinel Dynamics, Elaine stood by the window again. A habit now. Watching movement. Tracking momentum. Her phone buzzed. A text from Martin. You should see this. He forwarded a link. Midland Air's internal memo. Leaked. Not dramatic, but damning in its ordinariness. Language about optics, about managing narratives, about avoiding precedent. Elaine read it once, then again. They still didn't understand. She forwarded it to Denise, then to Alan Mercer. Then, after a moment's thought, to one more address. Rachel Donnelly. Minutes later, her phone rang. "Elaine," Rachel said, "this has crossed a line." "Yes," Elaine replied. "That's why I sent it." "They're circling the wagons," Rachel said, "and they're doing it badly." Elaine's voice remained even. "What happens next is up to you." Rachel sighed. "They won't like hearing that." "They rarely do," Elaine said. After the call, Elaine sat down and opened a fresh document. Not a memo, not a statement, a framework. She titled it simply, "Accountability Under Stress." She outlined decision points, where discretion entered, where bias could hide behind urgency, where documentation protected institutions more than people. This was her language, systems language, the kind that made excuses irrelevant. By late afternoon, her inbox filled with invitations, panels, consultations, think tanks, offers that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with influence. Elaine declined most, accepted one, a closed-door roundtable on transportation equity. No press, no cameras. As evening settled, she finally allowed herself to sit back and feel the weight of the last 48 hours. The exhaustion came then. Not crushing, just honest. She had not planned this, but she had prepared for it her entire life. Outside, the city dimmed. Inside, a quiet resolve sharpened. Midland Air had lost $3 million, but what they had triggered was far more expensive. And Elaine Brooks, calm at the center of it all, knew one thing with absolute certainty. This was no longer about her. The round table met in a government building that still smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood. No banners, no press badges, just a long table, a pot of coffee that had gone bitter hours ago, and a dozen people who understood that the real work of reform never happened on camera. Elaine Brooks took a seat near the middle. Not at the head, not at the edge. She had learned where influence traveled best. Across from her sat former regulators, airline safety directors, labor representatives, and two senators' senior policy advisors who never spoke unless they had already decided something mattered. A man in his 70s opened the discussion. Former Department of Transportation. Voice gravelly but steady. "We're here because a routine security escalation cost an airline $3 million, he said. "That's not normal." Elaine didn't correct him. She waited. "It's also not unprecedented," a woman to his left added. "It's just rarely documented by someone with leverage." There it was, the unspoken line drawn aloud. Elaine folded her hands on the table. "Leverage isn't the point," she said. "Visibility is." Heads turned. Some skeptical, some curious. "When a system fails someone without power," Elaine continued, "it gets logged as a complaint. When it fails someone with options, it gets examined. Same failure, different outcome." A younger policy advisor scribbled notes rapidly. "You're saying the system didn't malfunction," he said. "It performed as designed." "Yes," Elaine replied. "That's why it's dangerous." Silence followed. Not uncomfortable, concentrated. One of the airline representatives shifted in his chair. "With respect," he said, "security decisions happen in seconds. We can't always pause." Elaine met his gaze. "Then your systems shouldn't punish people for your speed." The room stirred. Not agreement, recognition. By the end of the meeting, no resolutions had been passed, no statements drafted. But something more durable had formed. Consensus without applause. A shared understanding that this wasn't about one airline or one woman. Elaine left before anyone could corner her for follow-ups. Outside, the late afternoon air felt heavier, charged. Her phone buzzed as she stepped into the car. Martin. They've officially asked to reopen talks. Elaine closed the door and leaned back. Who? Midland, Martin said. Board level this time. Full delegation. Elaine exhaled slowly. They're late. Yes, Martin replied. They know. Schedule it, she said after a moment. But not on their terms. She named the conditions calmly. Neutral location, written agenda, no press, and one non-negotiable point. The conversation would be about structure, not apology. That night, Midland's board argued behind closed doors. Voices rose, then sharpened, then quieted as numbers replaced feelings. $3 million was only the opening figure now. The real costs were compounding. Legal exposure, regulatory curiosity, investor confidence. Each line item heavier than the last. Thomas Whitaker listened more than he spoke. He had aged visibly in 2 days. Not physically, strategically. He understood now that the problem wasn't Elaine Brooks. It was the fact that she had walked through a door they didn't know existed. At Sentinel Dynamics, Elaine sat alone in her office, lights dimmed, city glowing beyond the glass. She reread the framework she had written earlier, marking it up with a pen instead of a keyboard. Old habit. Slower. More honest. She thought of the young airline employee who had apologized quietly in the terminal, of the veteran who had spoken up, of the countless people who never got either moment. Her phone rang again. Rachel Donnelly. They want to make concessions, Rachel said without greeting. Real ones. Elaine smiled faintly. Now they're speaking my language. They're prepared to accept independent oversight, Rachel continued. External review of escalation incidents. Quarterly reporting. Elaine said nothing. And, Rachel added, they're asking if you'll help design it. Elaine closed her eyes. This was the turn. The point where refusal became transformation. Tell them this, Elaine said carefully. I won't help them save face. I'll help them build something they can't hide behind. Rachel laughed softly. I thought you might say that. When the call ended, Elaine remained still. Not triumphant, not relieved. Focused. Outside, news trucks idled near Midland's headquarters, though no one had yet stepped to a podium. Inside boardrooms across the industry, quiet conversations were happening. Not about Elaine Brooks. About risk. About culture. About what happened when systems met scrutiny. $3 million had been the headline, but what Elaine had taken from them was far more unsettling. She had taken their certainty. And as she turned off the lights and prepared to leave, Elaine knew the story was no longer about a flight or a fund. It was about what came next. The meeting took place on a Tuesday morning in a law firm conference room that smelled faintly of leather chairs and burned coffee. Neutral ground, chosen carefully. No logos on the walls. No view of runways or stock tickers. Just glass, wood, and a long table that forced everyone to face one another without distraction. Elaine Brooks arrived 10 minutes early, not to claim territory, to observe. She noted the placement of chairs, the position of the water pitchers, the absence of nameplates. Control disguised as courtesy. Midland Air's delegation arrived together. Two together. Thomas Whitaker led them, followed by Karen Liu, two board members Elaine had only met in passing, and a consultant whose suit was too new to belong to the room. They all looked composed. They all looked tired. Elaine stood when they entered. Handshakes were exchanged. Brief, professional. No warmth yet. Warmth had to be earned. Thank you for agreeing to meet, Thomas began once everyone was seated. Elaine inclined her head. I agreed to listen. A subtle difference, noted by everyone. Karen slid a folder across the table. We've reviewed your framework, she said, in detail. And, Thomas added, We accept its premise. Elaine didn't open the folder. She folded her hands instead. Acceptance is easy, she said. Implementation is where organizations reveal themselves. One of the board members, a former manufacturing executive in his 70s, cleared his throat. We understand trust has been damaged. Elaine met his eyes. Trust wasn't damaged, she said. It was absent. I just happened to notice. Silence fell. Not hostile. Heavy. Thomas leaned forward. We're prepared to commit to independent oversight of escalation decisions, he said. External auditors, public reporting, real authority. Elaine waited. She had learned to listen for what followed the word and. And, Thomas continued, we're willing to tie executive compensation to compliance outcomes. That landed. Even the consultant shifted in his chair. Elaine exhaled slowly. That's significant. It needs to be, Karen said. We misjudged the risk. Elaine nodded. Yes. Another pause, this one longer. And the funding, Thomas said carefully. Elaine's expression remained neutral. That ship sailed. One of the board members stiffened. Elaine, he said, voice tight, we're talking about a partnership that benefits both sides. Elaine turned toward him. You're talking about restoring a transaction, she said. I'm talking about whether your systems deserve reinforcement. The consultant leaned in. With respect, Ms. Brooks, this could set a precedent that discourages decisive action in security matters. Elaine's gaze snapped to him, sharp now, focused. Good, she said. Decisive action without judgment is how people get hurt. The room went very still. Thomas rubbed his jaw. What would it take, he asked quietly, for you to reconsider? Elaine thought of the jet bridge, the clipped voices, the assumption baked into urgency. She thought of the framework she had written, the conversations unfolding beyond this room. It would take time, she said, and distance. Karen frowned. Distance? Yes, Elaine replied. I won't fund the system that failed me, but I will advise the one trying to fix itself. Thomas's shoulders sagged slightly, relief and disappointment colliding. As an external consultant. As an external conscience, Elaine said. The board member exhaled. That won't be easy. Elaine stood. Neither was being removed from a plane for doing my job. She gathered her coat. You can still build something better, she said. Just not with my money. No one argued. They knew better now. As Elaine left the building, rain began to fall. Not dramatic, just enough to darken the pavement and soften the edges of the city. She didn't open an umbrella. She welcomed the cold. Her phone buzzed. A message from Martin. They agreed? Elaine typed back. They conceded. Another message followed almost immediately. Press is asking if you're done with Midland. Elaine paused under an awning, watching water bead and slide down the glass. She typed slowly. Tell them I'm done being surprised. She slipped the phone away and stepped back into the rain. Behind her, in a quiet conference room stripped of symbols, a group of powerful people sat with the unfamiliar weight of accountability settling into their bones. And for the first time since this began, Elaine felt the story shifting away from confrontation and toward consequence. The hardest part was over. The part that lasted was just beginning. The announcement came on a Thursday afternoon, timed deliberately between market cycles. Not early enough to look reactive, not late enough to look evasive. Midland Air released a revised governance statement, outlining new escalation protocols, independent oversight, and executive accountability measures. No names were mentioned, no apologies offered. Just structure, just intent. The markets responded cautiously, not with applause, with attention. Elaine Brooks read the statement once, then set it aside. She had learned not to mistake motion for meaning. The real signal would come later, in quieter places, where incentives reshaped behavior and fear gave way to habit. At Sentinel Dynamics, the week had taken on a strange, suspended quality. Engineers still worked, meetings still happened, but under it all ran a current of awareness. The company had crossed into a different category, not just a vendor, a reference point. Elaine addressed her staff on Friday morning, not in an auditorium, in small groups, rotating through conference rooms, making eye contact with every person who mattered. What happened wasn't planned, she told them, but how we respond is. Someone asked if they should expect scrutiny. Yes, Elaine said, and we should welcome it. Systems improve when they're examined. By midday, 3 airlines had reached out. Carefully worded inquiries, exploratory language, no commitments yet. Elaine instructed Martin to listen, not negotiate. Momentum needed space to mature. That afternoon, Elaine received a call she had been expecting, though she hadn't known when. "Ms. Brooks," said the voice on the other end. Female, calm, authoritative. "This is Deputy Administrator Helen Morse, Federal Aviation Administration." Elaine closed her office door. "How can I help you?" "We're reviewing recent industry events," Helen said. "Your name has come up." "I imagine it has," Elaine replied. "We'd like to consult with you," Helen continued. "Not as a complainant, as an expert." Elaine sat down slowly. This was the pivot, the moment when private consequence edged toward public responsibility. "I'm willing to advise," Elaine said, "within clear boundaries." "Of course," Helen replied. "This would be informal. For now." After the call, Elaine remained seated, hands resting flat on her desk. She thought of the many years she had spent working adjacent to power, translating between engineers and executives, between policy and practice. She had never sought a platform, but platforms, she knew, often arrived disguised as disruption. That evening, Elaine attended a small dinner hosted by a regional business council. No press, no speeches, just conversation. Over dessert, a retired airline captain leaned toward her. "I flew for 40 years, he said quietly. "I saw good people make bad calls under pressure. What you did gave us room to breathe." Elaine met his gaze. "Pressure reveals priorities," she said. "I just held up a mirror." He nodded once. Nothing more needed. The following Monday, a story ran in a national business magazine. Not a profile, an analysis. How a routine security escalation exposed deeper governance flaws. Elaine's name appeared once, in context. That was enough. Midland Air's board convened again that week, this time without cameras, without consultants. They discussed succession planning, cultural audits, long-term risk. Thomas Whitaker listened more than he spoke. He understood now that leadership was not about controlling outcomes, but about surviving their exposure. Elaine did not attend. She didn't need to. Instead, she spent the afternoon with her team, reviewing a new proposal. Another airline, larger footprint, higher stakes. The numbers were bigger, the language more careful. Martin looked up from the spreadsheet. "This one's serious." Elaine nodded. They should be. She closed the file without signing anything. Not yet. As the sun dipped behind the buildings, Elaine stood at the window once more. A habit, now a marker of transition. She watched people move below, ordinary lives intersecting with systems they trusted without ever seeing. $3 million had been the headline, but what endured was the recalibration. the quiet understanding spreading through boardrooms and briefing papers. The decisions made under stress did not disappear. They accumulated. Elaine turned off the lights and gathered her things. The week had ended, but the work had not. She stepped into the hallway, her footsteps steady, unhurried. Somewhere, another flight was boarding, and this time the system would hesitate. Just enough. The hearing room was colder than Elaine expected. Not in temperature, but in tone. Marble walls, hard lines, microphones arranged with precision. Everything designed to flatten emotion into recordable sound. She took her seat without ceremony, hands resting calmly on the table, eyes forward, posture unyielding. Across from her sat executives, regulators, and staffers who had read about her for weeks, but had never truly looked at her until now. The chairwoman called the session to order. Her gavel struck once. Clean. Final. The room settled. Elaine spoke when invited. Not fast, not slow. Measured. She did not dramatize what had happened on the aircraft. She did not raise her voice when she described the jet bridge, the word concern, the way urgency had replaced curiosity. She spoke instead about decision chains, about escalation bias, about how systems rewarded speed over judgment and punished deviation even when deviation was the ethical choice. She spoke like an engineer, explaining a structural weakness, not a victim recounting harm. As she talked, faces shifted. Some leaned in, some stiffened. A few avoided her eyes altogether. The words landed anyway. When organizations are trained to act before thinking, Elaine said, they will always act on assumptions, and assumptions do not distribute themselves evenly. There was no applause. None was allowed. But the silence that followed carried weight, the kind that stayed. When the hearing recessed, the hallway outside filled with movement, cameras, aides, voices overlapping in practiced urgency. Elaine stepped aside, letting the current pass her by. She did not seek the microphones. She did not avoid them either. She stood where she was, composed, until a reporter finally asked something she chose to answer. This was never about me, Elaine said. It was about what systems do when no one is watching. That single sentence ran everywhere. By the end of the week, the Department of Transportation announced a formal review of airline escalation protocols nationwide. Not a mandate yet, a study. But studies led to language, and language led to policy. Everyone in the industry knew the pattern. Midland Air released another statement, this one longer, this one signed. It acknowledged structural failure without naming bias, the corporate equivalent of admitting fault while saving face. Their stock steadied, their board began the quiet work of change. Thomas Whitaker announced his retirement the following month. No scandal attached, just timing that spoke for itself. Elaine did not comment. At Sentinel Dynamics, the work accelerated. Not because of pressure, but because clarity had arrived. The new airline partnership moved forward deliberately. Different tone, different questions. They wanted to know how her systems flagged not just technical anomalies, but human ones. Where patterns hid. How escalation could be audited without paralyzing response. Elaine answered all of it, drawing diagrams on whiteboards, rewriting assumptions into architecture. The contract was signed without ceremony. No press release, no photographs. Just a wire transfer for $3 million, written out cleanly, and a clause added at Elaine's insistence. Independent review embedded by design. A month later, Elaine boarded a flight again. Same routine, same bag, same watch. Different airline. The boarding process was unremarkable, which was precisely the point. The gate agent smiled, checked her pass, waved her through. No hesitation, no extra questions. In the cabin, A young flight attendant paused when she reached Elaine's row. She hesitated, then spoke. "Good afternoon, Mom. Can I get you anything before we depart?" Elaine looked up, met her eyes, saw uncertainty, not suspicion. "Water would be fine," she said. The attendant nodded and returned moments later with a glass, set it down carefully. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. As the plane taxied, Elaine allowed herself a small breath. Not relief, recognition. Change did not arrive loudly. It arrived quietly, through altered behavior that no one announced. At cruising altitude, she opened her laptop, not to work on contracts or frameworks, but to review messages she had postponed. There were many. Some from strangers, some from people she knew only by reputation. Most said the same thing in different ways. "I saw myself in that moment. Thank you for not letting it disappear." She closed the inbox without replying, not because she didn't care, because she understood something now. Her role was not to reassure. It was to hold the line long enough for others to step forward. After landing, Elaine walked through the terminal unremarked. That, too, was data. Weeks later, she stood in a small auditorium at a university, invited to speak to students studying systems engineering and public policy. No cameras, no live stream, just young faces, notebooks open, waiting. Elaine didn't recount the story in detail. She didn't need to. Instead, she spoke about responsibility, about how power showed itself not in moments of command, but in moments of choice, about how withdrawing $3 million was not an act of punishment, but an act of alignment. "Money is loud," she said, "but silence can be louder, if you know when to use it." After the talk, a student approached her, nervous, thoughtful. "Do you think things really change?" he asked, catching himself too late. Elaine smiled gently. "They do," she said, "but not all at once, and not without effort." That night, back in her office, Elaine stood at the window one last time. The city moved below her, indifferent and alive. She thought of the jet bridge again, but it no longer tightened her chest. It had become a marker, a before. $3 million had been withdrawn. A line had been drawn. Systems had been forced to look at themselves. And somewhere, on a flight she would never be on, someone would pause, just long enough, ask one more question, choose a different outcome. Elaine turned off the light and left the office, the door closing softly behind her. The story would continue without her at the center. That was how she knew it had worked. If this story resonated with you, like, subscribe, and comment 3 words below.